Many of us remember 10 years ago when those horrible pictures from Abu Ghraib were on every newspaper, television, and radio. We were really stunned that these things were done in the name of America, our beloved country.
When the Senate torture report was finally released, all of us were shocked to learn what was being done in our name.
In spite of the legal restrictions on this kind of approach, CIA continued.
The report shows that the CIA committed acts of torture that were even more savage than we had known about. Detainees were waterboarded to the point of causing convulsions and vomiting. Detainees were subjected to so-called rectal feeding without any medical necessity. Detainees were placed in ice water baths to induce hypothermia. Detainees were told that their families would be sexually abused if they did not talk. A detainee was left chained to a concrete floor, partially unclothed, until he died of hypothermia. The CIA used a mentally handicapped relative of a detainee by imprisoning him and recording him crying so that that could be played for his family member. It also told detainees they would be killed in order to prevent information about what was done to them being made public.
President Obama, a Democrat, issues an executive order halting CIA torture on his second day in office. Then earlier this year, a Republican Senate passes legislation making the ban on CIA torture permanent. Republican-led U.S. Senate voted 78 to 21 to ban CIA torture. Should we be surprised? Maybe not. I think many in this country, right and left, center, want to break from that image of the American government as a government that tortures. Now, Senator John McCain, a decorated war hero, POW, on the Senate floor this year, made an eloquent case that torture isn't about them, about the enemy, if you will. It's about us. It's about the perpetrator. It's about the nation that tortures. How can the American people live up to the values we say define us as a nation if we can't repudiate torture? So yes, a Republican Congress repudiated and ended torture. It's a new day.
Our faith communities basically believe that torture is sin. And so when we think about the issue of torture, when we think about what we do to other human beings, man and woman's inhumanity to one another, it comes down to the issue of whether we are willing to let go of our past, give some sense of what the future ought to be, and turn around and give credence to the fact that we have failed in some significant ways to be a brother, a sister to another. And to acknowledge in this case means to again say, torture is sin. It is important that as a nation we become a better nation because of our willingness to admit our wrong, that as a nation we make a difference in being able to walk in an upright way.
As people of faith who believe that all people are created by God, we see this treatment of our fellow brothers and sisters as morally abhorrent.
So what should the presidential and congressional candidates and people of faith be saying right now about torture? Let's remember that in 2015, a Republican Congress joined a Democratic president to end the CIA torture program. So now you need to ask any candidate for public office, any office holder, presidential or otherwise, why would you ever support torture? Or why would you make a statement that we don't want to take any options off the table? We need to press these candidates. Ask them, how do you expect to get elected when you stand so far outside the mainstream of your own party, Democrat or Republican? So getting the United States out of the torture business really is the new normal. I do believe, and I think the faith community can lift this up, it is no longer normal for any candidate for public officer to be supporting torture. So I like to sit back and think sometimes, what might be on the mind of 2016 voters with torture? Well, one of the things we've known for a long time, and it's just a fact of life in this debate, when the American people are presented with torture in the theoretical, do you oppose torture? In the abstract. Sometimes good old American pragmatism kicks in, or people's fears, and people say, well, I guess I could support torture. And the public is split, actually, in polling on torture when the question is asked this way. But when they actually see what torture is, what it does to another human being, when they're asked to support specific forms of torture, waterboarding, ice baths, hanging someone from the ceiling for hours on end, that support for torture goes way, way down. Well, the Senate Intelligence Committee report gives very specific, very sickening actually, details on what the U.S. did when it tortured people. Few can imagine that they live in a country where their government would do this to another human being. In that sense, this report is a real game changer. No one going forward has the excuse that they don't know how ugly torture was. We like to say here that it's torture with a big T. It's torture where you can actually see what happened. And that does not have the support of the American public.
We have a responsibility to ensure that these crimes are never repeated. Those who are answerable to the U.S. public, the President, Congress, the CIA, and the Justice Department, must work with us to make it clear that torture will never be used again. The CIA should also be barred from running secret prisons. The President should ensure that all interrogations meet the Golden Rule standard. If we would not consider an action morally acceptable to be done to a captured American, then it should not be done to anyone else. The President has a responsibility to ensure that the full truth about the torture programs is made public. He should declassify the full report on the torture and rendition programs.
President Obama is running out of time to fulfill his promise to close Guantanamo, 6 months after Secretary of Defense Ashton Carter took office in early 2015. He signed off on only 6 transfers. This is far below the rate of his predecessor. The President's Department of Justice has chosen to contest the possible release for medical reasons of a detainee. Seriously, many in Congress have a goal to restrict transfers out of Guantanamo. They're going to try to make it impossible to close the prison there. Really? We want to continue to hold prisoners in Guantanamo? We want to be the country that holds people for over a decade in indefinite detention without trial? This doesn't uphold the Constitution. It says nothing about American values. In fact, it tramples on them. We've got to close Guantanamo before this president leaves office.
It's been more than a decade since the National Religious Campaign Against Torture was created. In that time, we have managed to create a virtual consensus among religious leaders and elected officials that torture is unacceptable as an instrument of national foreign policy by the United States. We have to go further, though. We need people in local churches across this country to bring this to the attention of their members of Congress and other elected officials so that we never ever return to a time when our nation uses torture.